Luke 10, 38 through 42. Page 1752. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you're worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, and indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Well, it's dinner time again. It's always dinner time in the Gospel of Luke. Lots of stories where they're eating together. You're always, if you're reading and following along with us, you're either eating at a dinner, you're headed to a dinner, or you are leaving dinner. All kinds of dinners in Luke. There are happy dinners, there are sad dinners, there's angry dinners, there's dinners with lots of people, and there's dinners with just a few to be an intimate little dinner, like the dinner with Levi. Jesus gets in trouble because he was there with tax collectors, violating what's right. They're unclean. That, of course, would make him unclean. But then there's, of course, feeding the 5,000. That's a big moment. A time then when you recall he was at a very small dinner when a woman came in and washed his feet with her tears and her hair. There was the other time where he was invited by a Pharisee and he violated the purity code because he didn't do the proper ceremonial washing beforehand, before he ate. And trouble with dinner here again in Luke 15, when they were brought charges that he kept eating with the wrong crowd, tax collectors and sinners. Jesus was always at the wrong place. Or the road to Emmaus, where they didn't know who Jesus was until he broke bread with them, and through that breaking of the bread, they recognized him. There's dinner all the time in Luke. And we have another dinner here. It's a meal time, and Martha has invited Jesus into her home. Mary, her sister, is there too. And Martha's, of course, in the kitchen. You got to get a meal ready if you're going to have someone over for dinner. That's always the catch. It's fun to have people over, then you got to cook the meal, though. And so Mary's there too, but Martha's got to prepare the meal. She and Mary are in different rooms. I sort of imagine Martha doing the old, coming around the corner and like looking around into the living room where her sister is sitting. You know with me? She's in the kitchen and she's doing this. She's going, trying to just, give her the old look. Jesus and Mary are talking, and you begin to wonder, how long did Martha cook in the kitchen before noticing that she was by herself? How long did it take for her to get that bubbling frustration, that anger that's coming up, that she was in there alone by herself? It says that she was distracted. I would bet. She's distracted by the work that has to get done. I do a lot of cooking in the house. It's a tiresome little job. You've got to focus on a lot of different things. A lot of work goes in to feed a meal to someone. Before you can break bread with someone, you've got to bake the bread. Before you bake it, you've got to, get the ingredients together. You can't, go to the store and get a box mix. You got to wait for the harvest time to get the wheat. Then you got to dry it out. You got to crush it up and do all these different things. There's a lot of work going on to get the meal ready for Jesus, who's the guest. She's distracted. She's distracted by the hard work, and she is, as I've been telling you, that's been peering around, waiting for me to get along with the story to see if Mary's ever going to get in the kitchen, Mary hasn't joined her yet in the kitchen. Martha's beginning to wonder why that is. There is work to be done. And so she starts to complain about it. It's interesting how she complains, because she doesn't do it in the way that maybe I would think and you would think it should be done. The way that we would do it, right? Someone's the guest in the living room and you've been in the kitchen and you do this. You come out and you stand, behind the guest. You're trying to get the other person's attention. You go, You know that you've done this before, right? Trying not to, of course, get Jesus' attention. He turns around, you go, oh, hi, yeah. You've done this many times, right? We've been here before. That's what we would do to get this attention. You'd get in that room and sort of try to get Mary's attention. And if you couldn't, it felt like she was just ignoring you, hoping Jesus wouldn't turn around. If that didn't work, you finally get a little bit closer and maybe you put your arm up on their shoulder and you go, excuse me, could I see it in the kitchen? You know what I mean? I need to see it in the kitchen. We've done this before. Well, she doesn't do that as far as we know. She doesn't do any of that. It's left out. It's left out. Not important enough for Luke to put in his story. It just says that she finally turns to Jesus. In fact, this is our first sign that these people are not strangers meeting in the home for the first time. They know each other. We know from the text this disciple group that's been following him that includes all of these different people cared for each other very deeply. And so she turns to Jesus and she asks him this question in verse 40. She says, "Don't you care?" That's not the only time in the New Testament where somebody turns to Jesus and says, "Don't you care?" It happens in a boat. "Lord, don't you care that we're about to perish?" Puts a little bit of a sting into the side of Jesus. "Don't you care? Don't you care that I'm doing all this work by myself? Tell her to get in here where she belongs so that we can get a meal that's appropriate for you." She complains. And I have to say, I have a little bit of empathy with her complaint. I've cooked Thanksgiving meals and Friendsgivings before, and while I say I like to do everything by myself, watching other people not help out usually means they get a spoon put in their hand. Don't you want to eat on time? Right? Don't you care? I empathize with her. She complains. And Jesus turns to her and he says this. He says, "Martha, Martha." I think it's interesting that he says her name 2 times. You have to be very careful. You don't. Well, you would. I have to be very careful, but we're going to step out of careful realm here for just a second. To put motive in the text where we don't know the exact motive behind it. The text is a little bit removed from our own experience, so I don't want to read too much into this, but I'm going to go to. I can't help but think, why was it said 2 times? Why say Martha, Martha? I don't think that he said, "Martha, Martha." You with me? I don't think there was angry behind it. That doesn't seem right to me. There seems to be a hint of empathy, of this pathos, this sorrow, this care in his voice. More like a "Martha, Martha." Doesn't that feel like it? Doesn't that feel more right than angry? "Martha, Martha." Where else in the Bible is anyone called by their name 2 times? So if we take a look, there's probably others. There's Absalom, oh Absalom. Called by David in a moment of pity and sorrow. "Absalom, oh Absalom, oh how I wished it would have been me who died in your place. Oh Absalom, my son." I think we're closer to a moment like that. A little bit of that sorrow, that pity, that grief. Where Jesus says, "Martha, you're upset." Now that depends on your translations there. Some have it, "You're worried," you're upset, or "you seem a little anxious." Now before we go on to more of what he says, what do you mean? What does she need to be worried about? What would she have to be so upset about? What worries might have her so upset? Well, if you just go back to the end of the last chapter, where we end with the Good Samaritan, and a little bit more before that, you might see why everyone is a little bit worried with this whole Jesus thing. That's where the text tells us that the days draw nearer for him to be taken, and he set his face towards Jerusalem. He's on his way to Jerusalem. There's plenty to worry about on your way to Jerusalem if you're a Jesus follower. Jerusalem's not a place that's going to bode particularly well for Jesus, and they know that. Jerusalem is the place where they stone the prophets. All three of them would have to know that trouble is lurking on the road to Jerusalem. And we know, and they had to know what was about to happen to Jesus. It says she's upset. I would think so. She's worried. She's worried to death. Not over baking bread for a meal, but she had to know this was probably the last meal they would have together before he ended up in Jerusalem. Indeed, she probably was a little bit worried. No wonder she wanted a little bit of comfort, some help in the kitchen. This isn't distracted over meal preparation. This is a rather somber moment for her. And so Jesus says to her, Mary has chosen the better part. Mary's chosen a better part. What better part? It's like, what is he referring to? She's visiting with Jesus. You get this little clue if you read the text a little closely. She was seated at his feet. Now that's not an informal phrase in the days of Jesus. She was at the feet of Jesus being taught before he heads on the way to Jerusalem. So what's she doing? She's being instructed by the teacher. Now, just a minute here, hang on. Women were not instructed by rabbis. That's not their right place. Maybe this has partly to do with why Martha was complaining. One commentary puts it pretty crisply on this little section. It says, Mary was acting like a man. In fact, there are several things with regard to rabbinic lore that made it very clear that she was, according to the traditions of the play of the day, out of place. Just a few. Some rabbinic midrash over this. Let thy house be a meeting house for the sages, and sit among the dust at their feet, and drink their words with much thirst. But do not talk much with womankind. Did you hear it? Did you hear it in there? We'll do a few others here. Another rabbinic saying, it's better to bury the Torah in the dirt to be forgotten than entrust it to the mouth of a woman. Is that clear enough? Better to teach your daughter lasciviousness than to teach her the law. Is it clear? She's out of place. And Jesus was instructing his students. She was sitting at the feet of the Master. That's the better part she chose. This is not an anti-kitchen story. This is not the anti-kitchen story. This is an anti-exclusionary story. Luke has a lot of these throughout his passage about exclusion. And that's why Jesus says at this very moment, on his way to Jerusalem, that she has chosen the better part. She has chosen to be a student of the rabbi. And he said, it shall not be taken away. That's lovely, isn't it? It shall not be taken away. Now, we've tried to delay this as long as we possibly could. In fact, there are entire organizations, denominations, and belief systems that don't even understand this text completely just yet. This is the Jesus who came across the Samaritan woman at the well. Now, as we know from last week, you don't have dealings with Samaritans. They're the arch enemy. They're the people you think it's all right you can hate. She comes across the Samaritan woman in Samaria at the well. Better to eat the flesh of swine than to eat the bread of Samaria. But he sent his disciples off to the local bakery that day in Samaria to get some Samaritan bread. And he talked with the woman at the well. This shall not be taken away. But it's taken us 2,000-something years to begin to understand this picture. In fact, if you were to look at any commentary understanding of this text from about 15 years ago or older, you wouldn't hear a single thing about what I've said. It talks about being distracted. Where's your centering? What are you focused on? That's not the point of this text. You read almost anyone from about 15 years ago to now, and they'll make it very clear that Jesus is violating the social structures of his day by allowing her to sit at his feet. He is upsetting the clear social boundaries of role in society. And he says, it will not be taken away. And it wasn't taken away. But he was. And let me tell you something. He wasn't taken away because he loved children. He wasn't taken away because he told lovely little stories we called parables. He was taken away because he continued to violate the structures of his society. For that, he was taken away. And so for all the Marys of the world, of whatever name you have or place you have been excluded, no, not right here, you go over here. No, you can't do that, you belong over here. There is a name, Mary. And he said the good news. Mary chose the better part, and it will not be taken away. And in the Spirit, his name continues to violate our social structures of our time today. And it shall not be taken away. Thank God. Let's pray.